I feel that I'm on solid footing when I say that as goes the Gulf of Mexico, so goes the Tampa Bay area. To help us take a closer look at the Gulf, we are welcoming UF Professor of History, Dr. Jack Davis, to our campus today. Dr. Davis is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. I know, although I do realize you're a captive audience, but I appreciate those two. It's a real pleasure to be here. I grew up in Pinellas County, in Largo actually, and like you, I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, and it was very much a part of my childhood, my teen years, my young adult years as well. I was the kind of person who did everything on or in the Gulf of Mexico. And I've lived, now I live landlocked in Gainesville, Florida, which is actually pretty difficult because I miss the Gulf so much. But a few years ago, I had written a biography of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And when I finished that book, I was looking around for a new book to write. And when I learned that nobody had written a comprehensive history of the Gulf of Mexico, first of all, I was dumbfounded. I was incredulous. I couldn't believe that nobody had written a book. I mean, it seemed so obvious that someone would write a history of the Gulf of Mexico. When I realized there was not one, I saw a need there. And, but also I saw a subject that was a really ideal fit for me, having this lifelong, intimate relationship with the Gulf of Mexico. But there were a number of reasons, a few other reasons why I wrote this book. One is that historians had overlooked it, and that gap needed to be filled. You can look at the index of your U.S. history text at your school, the U.S. history text that we use at the University of Florida, and there's a good chance you won't find the Gulf of Mexico even listed in the index. And if it is, it's only mentioned in passing. And so I wanted to bring the story of the Gulf of Mexico into the American historical experience where it belongs. The book, I should say, covers the period from geological formation to the present, focusing on the 5 U.S. states. But another reason why I decided to write this book is because the American popular image of the Gulf had become very narrow to one of the Gulf as either an oil supplier or a hurricane alley, maybe a vacation spot. Hurricane Katrina and the headline news during that event in 2005 had, I believe, robbed the Gulf of its true identity to some extent. And then the BP oil spill of 2010, an 87-day nightmare that summer. The Gulf of Mexico was headline news every day, right beside oil spill. And for many years after, and probably even today, when you Google just Gulf of Mexico, the selections that would come up were always associated with the oil spill. So with this book, I wanted to restore the Gulf's true identity. I wanted my readers to know that there is this wonderful sea, this living, giving sea, as I call it in the book, on the southern shores of the United States. And I'm an academic, but I don't write academic books. You write an academic book, what happens is it ends up on a cold steel shelf in an academic library. You can do a $20 test. That means you go in, you pull the book off the shelf, go to page 100, put a $20 bill in there, return 10 years later, pull the book off the shelf, and retrieve your $20. Because nobody reads them. So I had always envisioned my audience for this book as a general readership, intellectually curious audience, such as yourself. And not just a regional audience, but a national readership. And I wanted my readers to know that Americans, all Americans, are connected to the Gulf of Mexico, both historically and ecologically. So connected in those two ways, both historically and ecological, whether they had seen the Gulf of Mexico or not. And let me give you an example how the Gulf really doesn't have its due place in the American historical narrative. What is the largest real estate deal in U.S. history? And Donald Trump has nothing to do with it. Louisiana Purchase of 1803. So what did we learn about the Louisiana Purchase? We learned that President Jefferson wanted the land west of the Mississippi River. That would double the size of the United States. So he made this real estate deal with Napoleon Bonaparte to acquire that land. And that's true. He wanted that land. It was important to him for the expansion of the U.S. But equally important, if not more important to him, was control of the Mississippi River. Because with that purchase, he got New Orleans. Whoever occupied New Orleans had control of the Mississippi River, and whoever had control of the Mississippi River controlled commerce, controlled trade in North America and on the Gulf of Mexico. And so, in fact, what he paid for all that territory west of the Mississippi, he paid double for New Orleans. And that gave him access to the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico, and also gave the U.S. its first Gulf front waterfront, 300 and some odd miles. But Jefferson always believed that the Gulf of Mexico was rightfully an American sea, not a Spanish sea, as it was known in the early 19th century, and for hundreds of years before that. And he advised all the presidents who followed him or at least as long as he was alive, to try to acquire Cuba. And where is Cuba located? Right at the entrance of the Gulf of Mexico. And you have just over 100 miles to the west of Cuba that gives you access to the Gulf, 115 miles to the east, northeast of Cuba that give you access. Whoever occupied Cuba could control the Gulf of Mexico. And the United States eventually did make a general. Well, let me share that story with you in a minute. What came next after Louisiana was what territory on the Gulf of Mexico? You guys should know that. What Spanish territory? What's that? The Floridas, the two Floridas, West Florida and East Florida. And in West Florida in those days ranged from the Mississippi River all the way along with East Florida to the Atlantic Ocean, and as far north as present-day Montgomery, Alabama, and Jackson, Mississippi. And the U.S. got the Floridas courtesy of who? Or whom? Andrew Jackson. General Andrew Jackson in 1817 came down from his plantation in Tennessee to wrest the Floridas away from the Spanish. And after he completed his task, forced the Spanish to go to the negotiating table to give up the Floridas to the United States. He turned around to his bosses in Washington. Now, first of all, I should say that it's questionable about whether or not he actually had permission from Washington to go down to Florida and do what he did and seize Florida from the Spanish. It was, in fact, an international controversy what he did in Florida. But after he did it, he turned around to his bosses in Washington and said, give me the money and the men and I'll get you Cuba too. The leadership in Washington said, back off, Andy, you've done enough, go back to your plantation, we'll put you on the $20 bill, and we'll take care of Cuba ourselves. And eventually the U.S. did make a generous offer to Spain to try to buy Cuba. And Spain responded with the equivalent of the middle finger. And it said it would rather see the island sunk in the bottom of the sea than in the possession of the Americans. And so, what came next? The U.S. had Louisiana, it had the Floridas, had approximately 1,000 miles of shoreline. What came next was Texas. And Thomas Jefferson always believed that Texas would one day be an American state, not only an American state, but the richest American state. And the U.S. finally annexed Texas in 1835, 9 years after Jefferson died. So there's a bit of, and that, with the acquisition of Texas, Florida occupied almost to the mile, exactly 1/2 of the Gulf of Mexico shoreline. Who are the other countries that have shoreline on the Gulf? Cuba, which we mentioned. Who else? Mexico. Anybody else? No. Now you're getting down to the Caribbean. Just those three. And so there's a bit of U.S. history that we don't associate with the Gulf of Mexico, typically. And now, what the U.S. ended up getting with the Gulf of Mexico, not only control of the shipping of commerce, but it got one of the richest estuarine environments in the world. The Spanish had been on the Gulf of Mexico for over 300 years. They never developed a commercial fishing trade. The British were on the Gulf of Mexico. The French were on the Gulf of Mexico. They did not develop a commercial fishing trade to any extent. It was enterprising Americans, after Jackson was able to seize the Floridas, it was enterprising Americans who launched commercial fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, developed the commercial fishing industry that we know today. Today, for the U.S., commercial fishing in the Gulf of Mexico is a $20+ billion industry. 80% of the domestic shrimp come from the Gulf of Mexico. Over 40% of the domestic oysters come from the Gulf of Mexico. That's thanks to that remarkably wealthy estuarine environment. And who do you suppose were these commercial fishermen who launched the trade on the Gulf of Mexico in the early 19th century? Where do you think they were from? None. They came from New England. New England fishermen, New England, of course, is where American commercial fishing was all but invented. New England fishers would come down to the Gulf of Mexico in the early 19th century in the wintertime to get away from the cold waters, also because they had overfished many of their cod grounds in the Northeast. They would come down to the Gulf of Mexico in the wintertime and fish for the season. They are our original snowbirds. And they would trade at the ports of New Orleans and Pensacola, Apalachicola, and Havana. And then they would return for the warmer months. Some of them stayed permanently. You guys are familiar with Destin, Florida, right? Destin, Florida has not always been a condo canyon. It was it actually began as a commercial fishing village, founded by Leonard Destin, who was a fisherman who came down to the Gulf of Mexico from Connecticut in 1835. And by the 1870s, anybody here perhaps from Pensacola, originally from Pensacola? One person, okay. In Pensacola, you guys are very proud of your Spanish heritage because it was the capital of Spanish West Florida. Very proud of your Confederate heritage too, because generally Pensacolans are. Pensacolans do a Confederate reenactment every year. It's on 2 days. The first day they lie. The first day they tell the truth. They let the federal troops win. Nobody comes to that. On the second day, they lie and let the Confederates win. Everybody comes to that. Am I right? Yeah. And but what Pensacolans don't know about is their New England heritage. You can go to New England go to Pensacola in the 1870s, which was the premier commercial fishing port on the Gulf Coast, and you would hear a New England accent as readily as you would a Southern accent or any accent from around the world. As a matter of fact, in Pensacola. And the names on the side of the fish houses in Pensacola were all names of New Englanders. And so this is a city that actually grew to prominence on the red snapper. And there were many other places around the Gulf of Mexico like that got their start as fishing villages, and including many along southwest Florida in this area. Pinellas County at one time in the 1950s recorded the largest catch in commercial catch in fish in terms of weight on the west coast of Florida. We don't think of Pinellas County as a commercial fishing community, but it was at one time. But also, not only was there commercial fishing, there was sport fishing on the Gulf of Mexico. Now many people, what's the mainstay of our tourist economy around here? It's beachgoing, right? Well, tourism didn't start with beachgoing on the Gulf of Mexico. It started with sport fishing in the 19th century. In 1885, a New York architect by the name of William Halsey Wood hooked the first tarpon on record. A tarpon are these big fish. In those days, it was people were catching, or after Wood, they were catching tarpon that weighed 150 to 200 pounds. Wood hooked the first one on record in 1885 down by Sanibel. And when he hooked that tarpon, it set the sport fishing world, and I'm not exaggerating that term, world on fire. Everybody knew that if you could hook a tarpon, you would have this wonderful fighting fish on your hands. They just didn't quite know how to hook it. They knew how to harpoon it, and then they would tie it off to the front of their two-man skiff and let the tarpon tow the skiff around for 45 minutes and do these aerial acrobatics to entertain the people. And so they knew they'd have this great fighting fish. And once Wood hooked that first tarpon, people from the Northeast, men and women from the Northeast, from the Midwest, from the British Isles converged on Southwest Florida and southern Texas to go tarpon fishing. And it would take, just to get from New York to the Fort Myers area, it took 3 days of travel, if you were lucky in those days. But people came down in droves to catch the tarpon. Now the tarpon is typically an offshore fish, but every summer, spring and summer, it comes into the estuaries and feeds. As I say in my book, fishing for tarpon was like going deep sea fishing without having to go out to the deep sea. Now eventually these tarpon fishers, these tarpon tours, take a toll on the tarpon population. By the turn of the century, they're not biting in the same numbers as they had before. But by then, the tarpon tourists are starting to pay attention to the beaches in Florida. These beautiful, stunning, white sand beaches. And so many of them start coming for the beaches rather than for the fish. Where do you suppose that white quartz sand comes from? Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains at one time were as tall as the Himalayan mountains. And over eons, glaciers and rain and wind eroded the top of the Appalachian Mountains and washed the white quartz sand down streams and rivers, particularly the Apalachicola River, down to the Gulf of Mexico, which distributed the sand. We're fortunate, distributed the sand to the Florida Peninsula and the Panhandle. And so nature delivered Florida's beautiful white beaches. It delivered its tourist economy as well. And now, anybody here seen in Louisiana Beach? They're really ugly, aren't they? They are as hard as this stage, and they're about this color. And have you ever seen anybody ever seen a plowed field in Iowa? That's a future Louisiana beach. Anybody seen a Texas beach? You guys are just worldly. You've been everywhere. So Texas beaches are a little bit much nicer than Louisiana, but I would argue not as nice as Florida's. The sand comes in beige, pink, and yellow, and some white. That's because the Brazos and the Colorado rivers and the Rio Grande drain land all the way up to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And whatever terrain those rivers flow through, they pick up sediment and bring it down to the Gulf of Mexico to build beaches, but also build the barrier islands. All the way around the Gulf of Mexico, there are barrier islands fronting the mainland. Those rivers are extremely important to the estuarine environment, as are the barrier islands. Why are the rivers important to the estuarine environment? What do you need? What's the elixir you need for an estuary? Fresh mix of fresh water and salt water. That's right. And the rivers deliver the fresh water. The rivers deliver the sediment, build the barrier islands. The barrier islands now cordon in the fresh and salt water in the bays and the bayous where those estuarine environments are. The rivers also bring nutrients for those estuaries. Some 116 rivers flow to the Gulf of Mexico. The majority of those flow through the 5 U.S. states, bringing 85% of the fresh water to the Gulf of Mexico, which is why the U.S. states are endowed with the greater estuarine wealth of the Gulf of Mexico. Those rivers drain over 60% of the lower U.S., reaching as far as western Texas, up to the Canadian provinces, and west to, as I mentioned earlier, the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And those rivers deliver sediment, fresh water, nutrients, and in the modern period they've been delivering something else. What is that? Pollution. That's exactly right. So whatever is put on the ground or dumped in the rivers and streams in the drainage areas of the rivers that flow to the Gulf of Mexico ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so the pollution that the Gulf suffers isn't just local pollution. That pollution comes from faraway places. Let me give you an example. There are a number of you here who grew up in Pinellas County, as I did. And when I was a kid fishing on Tampa Bay in the 1970s, about the only thing I could catch was a croaker. If I got really lucky, I'd catch a speckled trout. The only bird life I saw were gulls and brown pelicans. Every bay and bayou around the Gulf of Mexico by the late 1960s was on the verge of collapse. They had lost 50, 60, 70 in cases of Escambia Bay in Pensacola, 95% of their seagrass beds. That's an estuarine environment. You lose the seagrass bed, you lose the fish, you lose the marine life, you lose the bird life. And you lose your sport fishing and your commercial fishing trade, which was happening all around the Gulf of Mexico by the late 1960s. And the culprit was, yes, in part industrial pollution, but primarily wastewater, raw sewage. Every municipality around the Gulf of Mexico was dumping raw sewage into the nearshore waters. And, you know, St. Pete does on occasion still, unfortunately. That's another story. But it wasn't just the shoreside municipalities, it was those faraway places. There were 8 wastewater treatment plants in Alabama dumping raw sewage down the Escambia River, which was ending up in Escambia Bay. And you know how Alabama is located above West Florida. I describe Alabama in my book as the buttocks sitting on the throne of West Florida, both figuratively and literally. But what did we do? This is what gives me hope for the future of the Gulf of Mexico. We cleaned up those waters. In 1972, Congress passed and President Nixon signed the Clean Water Act. And everybody pitched in. Local volunteers, environmental conservation groups, civic organizations, businesses, politicians and policymakers at the local, state, and national level. Everybody pitched in to bring those bays and bayous back to life. Replanting seagrass beds, restoring mangrove forests, and indeed we cleaned up those waters and they came back to thriving life. There are birds and fish today on Tampa Bay I never saw as a kid. I never saw a roseate spoonbill. I never saw a wood stork. I never saw a bald eagle until the 1990s. Now those birds are everywhere. That's because those waters are clean. And now, not every place is pristine. Not every place is healthy as Tampa Bay around the Gulf of Mexico. Many of them are, whether in Texas or Louisiana or here. But there are still some hot spots. You guys have probably heard of the Gulf of Mexico Dead Zone. And the Gulf of Mexico Dead Zone is exactly what is exactly what its name is. It's an area in which there is no oxygen, or so little oxygen that nothing can live. And it forms off the coast of Louisiana every summer, reaching the size of the state of Delaware, in some summers the size of the state of Connecticut. That is a dead area. Any marine life that cannot get out of the dead zone as it's forming will die. And when I was researching my book, the dead zone, I discovered that the dead zone was born in the 1950s. You guys are all familiar with the baby boom, right? And the baby boomers. Many of you have parents who are baby boomers. Some of you have parents that are younger than baby boomers. And I discovered a direct connection between the birth of the Gulf of Mexico dead zone and baby boom era Saturday morning cartoon commercials. So I'll say that again. I discovered a direct connection between the birth of the Gulf of Mexico dead zone in the 1950s and baby boom era Saturday morning cartoon commercials. Does everybody know what that connection was? Sugar's kind of, you want to say more? Part of it, but not the main issue. Cereal, breakfast cereal. Before World War II, breakfast cereal was considered a health food. It was not pre-sweetened. That only happened after the baby boom. Cereal manufacturers said, we're not making any money selling this health food. Let's sell cereal to baby boomers. And the way to do that, they had to sweeten it. But where is cereal made of what? Wheat and corn, sweetened with what? High fructose corn syrup. Where does the wheat and corn come from? It comes from, it's all grown in the Midwest, in the Mississippi River Basin. The sugar beets that produce the earlier pre-sweeteners, and the corn that is part of the high fructose corn syrup. That's all grown in the Midwest. And fertilizing those lands sends all of this agricultural runoff down the Mississippi River, which is responsible for the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. You guys are lucky. I usually don't tell my audiences the answer to that question. I usually say that if they want to know, they have to read the book. And that way they end up buying it. So we have hotspots like that. Galveston Bay in Texas, which is the largest estuary in the Gulf of Mexico, suffers 200 to 300 toxic spills a year. The BP oil spill, believe it or not, is not the worst environmental disaster that the Gulf of Mexico has suffered. Every day in the Gulf of Mexico is an environmental disaster that exceeds the BP oil spill. When you factor in what comes down all those rivers to the Gulf of Mexico, when you factor in the storm water that runs into the Gulf of Mexico, the engineering projects all around the Gulf of Mexico, those bridges, those causeways, the inlets, the channels, the canals that have been dug around the Gulf of Mexico, disrupting nearshore currents and having a negative impact on the estuarine environment. The oil industry has cut 10,000 miles of canals through the Louisiana coastal marshland. Louisiana may not have beautiful beaches, but it has a stunning coastal environment with its saltwater and freshwater coastal marshland. 5,300 square miles of marshland, unsurpassed in the United States, equaled by few places in the world, but with 10,000 miles of canals slicing up that marshland, contributing to the erosion of the coast. Louisiana is the only state in the country that is growing smaller in size, in part because of those canals and also because of levees and dikes along the Mississippi River, which is another story. But let me repeat, I have hope for the future of the Gulf of Mexico. What gives me hope is that with bringing these bays back to life, we've shown that the will to do so, to preserve and restore, to restore, and to be stewards of the estuarine environment is indeed possible. The best thing we can do for the Gulf of Mexico right now is to restore the living shoreline, which are coastal marshes, seagrass beds, oyster beds, and in this part of the Gulf of Mexico, mangrove forests. What is a living shoreline? It's an estuarine environment, meaning it's nursery, it's birthplace, nursery, and habitat for marine life. But the other reason why these living shorelines are important is because they are our best defense against intense seas. They are our best defense against sea level rise, better than concrete seawalls, which contribute to shoreline erosion. So there's a win-win, but actually with the living shoreline, there's a win-win-win. The third win is that living shorelines are fantastic carbon sinks, absorbing carbon out of the air and out of the water. And there are universities, there are environmental groups, and there are private landowners all around the Gulf Coast that are indeed restoring the living shoreline and reaping great benefits from doing so. And then finally, the other thing that gives me hope for the future of the Gulf of Mexico is you guys. It's your generation. It's your future. You guys clearly have your eyes on the future. You care about the future. Realize that my generation and other generations have not left you with the cleanest of the environment, the healthiest of the environment. You recognize that a healthy environment is not just about birds and fish, it's also about human health. You recognize that ecological viability also translates into economic viability. Where the ecology is in good shape, the economy is always in good shape. Where the ecology is in bad shape, the economy is not as robust as it could be. You guys recognize that. You've already, many people your age have taken it around the world, taken up leadership positions to guide us to a better future with a healthier environment. So I'm really hoping that you guys come through. And I think you'll rise to the occasion. So why don't I stop there and address any questions that you might have.